Dimitri, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me to present my paper on the valuation effects of trade. The usual disclaimer is that the views expressed here are my own and do not indicate concurrence by the Boston Fed, the Board of Governors, or the Federal Reserve System. So when a firm starts trading in international markets, they need to pick a currency in which to price their products. We know that typically, in front of this choice, firms tend to pick the dollar, more or less regardless of the identity of their partner. So much so that 40% of world trade is today specified in dollar terms, even though the United States account for around 10% of total world trade. Now, the literature has focused on price stability in dollar terms so far as an explanation for why we see typically little movements in relative prices after exchange rate fluctuations. And as a consequence, also why we see less movements than expected on volumes of trade. Now, this paper highlights the fact that even in a world with widespread dollar stability, from the point of view of companies that are not in the United States, the value of trade of their merchandise will move together with the exchange rate if expressed in domestic currency terms. So the intuition is quite mechanical. Imagine that you're a French firm that is selling goods to Japan, and these goods are dollar priced. These goods, I will verify, and other people before me have verified, that they are unresponsive in dollar terms to exchange rate shock. So after a euro weakening, these dollar sales that are coming in into the French firm balance sheets will have a larger than expected cash flow impact in euro terms whenever they're deposited in the bank account. And on the same side, on the opposite side for imports, if this firm in the short term can only import dollar price goods, whenever the euro weakens, this firm will have to pay a nominal cost that is higher in the short term. I call these kind of effects invoice valuation effects because they are dependent on the exchange rate between the euro, in this case for France, and the invoice valuation that is specified, and the invoice currency that is specified in the contracts of this firm. Now, the open question regarding this invoice valuation effect is whether they lead to liquidity issues for firms that trade in international markets. And as a consequence, whether they can impact investment and employment decisions. So whether they have a real effect on these firms' decisions. Now, it has been quite hard to study these questions so far because of data limitations. But I can use a novel data set on French firms' trading activities that merges detailed information on currency of invoicing of French firms with their balance sheet declarations. The paper has a very micro to macro approach, and it has results that are at 3 different levels of disaggregation. At the most disaggregated level, I measure the exchange rate pass-through into transactions of firms that are priced in dollars. So everything here is at the product level. In the second part of the paper, I measure exchange rate pass-through into firms' operations, and specifically, I measure the exchange rate pass-through on firms that are most exposed to dollar pricing contracts. And finally, with a partial equilibrium macroeconomic approach, I study whether the estimates that I find at the firm level are likely or not to generate large macroeconomic impacts for France overall. The assumption to understand this paper, the identification sample, to understand why I can interpret my shock as a causal effect of exchange rates on firms' operations, is that exchange rate shocks are disconnected from the real decision of the most exposed firms to dollar pricing, except through the invoice valuation effect that I'm interested in. So it's kind of similar to an instrumental variable interpretation. And importantly, I do not rely on the fact that the currency of invoicing of firms is exogenous, or that I totally understand why a firm picks one currency or another. Everything here is interpreted as conditional on a firm making some decision at the beginning of the sample. What is the effect of an exchange rate shock that is expected for on these firms? Now, all my results are relative to this invoice valuation income treatment that I apply to firms or to products. It is defined as a benchmark proxy of income that can be expected on a firm out of the dollar pricing exposure at the beginning of the sample, and then multiplying that exposure by a yearly euro value fluctuation. So imagine that you are a French firm that typically has 100 euro worth of sales that are dollar priced. And then in a specific year, there is a 1% euro devaluation. My invoice valuation income treatment will say that there should be 1 euro of income that is simply due to the fact that there is a currency fluctuations. And now the exposure of these sales generated 1 extra euro just because we are converting dollars into euros again. And this euro should be fully expected as long as prices and quantities don't respond to this currency fluctuation. So this 1 euro of invoice valuation, I observe at the border generate 60 to 80 cents merchandise value response. What is this? This is basically a pass-through estimation. That is equivalent to saying that an exchange rate shock has a 60 to 80% pass-through into the merchandise value of firms in euro terms. The fact that the pass-through is so similar to 100% means that we're actually fairly close to a world in which the prices and quantities of firms in the short term at the 1 year horizon don't respond much to exchange rate shocks. Now, at the firm level, I observed that this 1 euro of invoice valuation generates 40 to 80 cents cash flow response on firms. The fact that these estimates at the firm level are so similar to the effects that I observe at the border imply that most of these invoice valuation that I observe at the border are actually absorbed into the operational cash flow of firms that are declared in the tax declarations. When I was starting this paper, I remember I wasn't expecting such a large effect on operational cash flow. I think this is non-trivial per se. Firms can do a lot of things to avoid having their profits have an impact on or be dependent on the merchandise value at the border. So I think this is interesting result per se, which I will expand on later in the presentation. I also observed that this 1 euro of invoice valuation generates 0 to 30 cents on the euro response in salaries and 0 to 5 cent response in capital expenditure. Now, why do these estimates vary so widely here? It's because firms are different. There are heterogeneous effects that I estimate according to the kind of firm that is exposed to this kind of shocks. And I will expand on this kind of heterogeneous effects also later in the presentation. Finally, the partial equilibrium macroeconomic exercise that I run on the firm level estimates find that there is plausibly little impact for France overall out of this invoice valuation effect. And that is mainly for 2 reasons. First of all, the largest firms in my sample, the ones that account for a lot of investment and employment of France, are typically exporters. And exporters are typically importers. And what I observe is that the exporters that are more likely to do dollar pricing also import in dollars. So there is a kind of operational hedging that these firms are running that basically offsets within their balance sheets a potentially large effect on their gross trade of an exchange rate shock. But even conditional on hedging, the most exposed firms in my sample are still very large and liquid. And so even though their cash flow have a large pass-through, of exchange rate shocks, their investment and employment decisions don't necessarily change because of these fluctuations in nominal trade, because these firms have ways to finance worthy investments if they need to. Now, if you want, could be a good time to stop for clarifying questions. I don't know if there's any, otherwise I can go on. Okay, so what are the main contributions of this paper? First of all, I focus on a slightly novel channel to think about real effects of exchange rate shocks. Typically, when we think of real effects of exchange rate shocks, we either think of competitiveness effects, especially on world prices, or we think about the financing that, especially in emerging markets, companies and governments do. They typically have a lot of liabilities that are denominated in a foreign currency, and so that has repercussions in real variables too. In this paper, I focus on a slightly neglected, in a sense, currency mismatch that firms have hidden in their income statement. There is a currency mismatch that typically comes from trade flows of firms. And it's the currency mismatch that's coming from buying and selling in foreign currencies. And it all hinges on the fact that prices in the short term are stable in the invoice currency of so in the currency of the contracts of these firms. So I push a little bit for, in a sense, a story that investigates the effect of an exchange rate shock at the firm level rather than at the product level, and a story that tries to measure the nominal profitability of firms in front of an exchange rate shock rather than, and in a sense, on top of standard channels like competitiveness and financial structure effects that these exchange rates have on firms. The second contribution is the creation of this, what I call this invoice valuation index or invoice valuation income effect. My invoice valuation income treatment is nothing but an invoice weighted exchange rate shock that tends to outperform standard effective exchange rate indexes at explaining firms' activities. And that is simply because prices and values of trade are stable in the units of the currency of invoicing. And so, of course, if you can observe the currency of invoicing of firms, you're going to be able to better predict the income fluctuation of that these firms are exposed to. Third, whenever you focus on exposure of firms towards a pricing that is not in a currency of the firm that is exporting or importing, and nor is the same currency of your partner, and so you exploit a vehicular currency exposure, you have two convenient things that happen for identification. First of all, the invoicing exposure of firms does not necessarily coincide with the trading exposure of firms. So I have firms that in the very same country invoice in different currencies. And then I have also firms that in very different countries invoice in the very same currency, and that is the dollar. And that means that I can control for trade exposure of firms, so demand and supply shocks that these firms are exposed to per se. Also, whenever you focus on the dollar, whenever the United States is not the trading partner, you can also always control for exchange rate shock between the partner currency and the dollar, in case you are concerned about correlations that sometimes happen between, especially in emerging markets, between fluctuations of the partner currency and demand and supply shocks of the partners. Finally, the paper shows a straightforward narrative on how there can be microeconomic evidence on large exchange rate pass-through on prices and values of trade together with an older sort of macroeconomic evidence on the exchange rate disconnect with macroeconomic fundamentals. How can there be both of these stories going on? Well, in a sense, in a nutshell, the paper shows that firms have made decisions ex ante so they know that exchange rate shock matter a great deal to determine their values of trade and the price fluctuations, but they made choices ex ante to either offset those shocks through operational hedging, or in any case, if they're exposed, they can deal with it. They know they're large enough and liquid enough to deal with them. And as a consequence, there aren't large macroeconomic effects, at least for a country like France, and with the pricing exposure that I observe in this specific country.
Sorry, Mar, can I interrupt you for a second? So there are two questions.
This is a perfect moment, yes.
So one question is from Sebastian Fanelli. So he asks whether this estimate from the previous slide of 40–80% into the cash flow, whether it takes into account already the import channel, or this is just the export channel.
Yes, this is very important. These are net exposure of firms. So it's at the border here, you're right that I consider exports and imports in isolation, but when I aggregate the exposure here, the dollar pricing exposure at the firm level, I consider that there are exports and imports, and it only measured the net exposure of firms, so exports minus imports in dollars. So all of these pass-throughs are conditional on an exposure which is either negative or positive. Yes, absolutely.
I see, thanks. Okay, and the second question from Oli.
Yeah, can I ask, it's a related thing. So you will get to it, I think, when you show the overall patterns in the data, but one thing I find actually very surprising, but it's actually true across many European countries. We think of European countries as very open, but how much they trade outside of Eurozone is actually quite small. So when you think of very open European countries, but look at their trade outside of Eurozone, they look like US, like a very closed economy, in fact, with something like, you know, total of 7% of exports to GDP ratio and imports to GDP ratio. And so what I was kind of curious is, even if you think of a very large French exporter, right, most of its exports would be within the Euro area. And so as a result, if you just do a simple back of the envelope based on export shares outside of Euro area, which are small, would it be surprising that you go from this big elasticities at the border to small elasticities for overall salaries and, you know, investment? And so maybe already that back of the envelope gives you most of the sort of like disconnect, right? And then these additional channels are not as essential. And so it's interesting to do this decomposition into like this baseline sort of closeness of France and the extra channels, the extra mileage you get from those channels.
Yeah, very good point. I 100% agree with you. There is that channel going on. Now, the aggregate estimates that I will show are only sort of taken into consideration. So like I scale them up for only like between the firms. So it's like an aggregate effect, but only within the sample of firms that trade a lot with like extra European countries. Now, all the estimates that I will show you, if you then scale them by GDP, they become even smaller. So yes, there's that channel that is going on that I didn't mention. Absolutely. You can you can think of it as being like these exposure in absolute terms are not that large if you compare them with the like total size of the top 100 exporters in my sample. Yeah. No more questions. Okay, so there are no more questions. I will skip the literature in the interest of time, and I'll jump right into it, into the presentation. So I will talk a little bit about the data, and then I will give detail on the 3 level of disaggregation of my results. So I use 2 main data sets. One is a standard French customs declarations. I use all transactions over 1,000 euros from 2000 to 2017. I only focus on extra European Union trade, which accounts for 40% of the total trade of France. And I have the currency of invoicing information of trade only after the year 2011. I link these French custom declarations with standard variables from income and balance sheet statements of firms that are declared to the tax authority of France. So to give you an idea of the currency of invoicing use of French firms, here in this table, I divide between two kinds of firms in my sample. On the one hand, there are what I call the exporter firms. These are firms that on average export more than they import. And then all other firms that are called domestic oriented. These firms are the ones that import more than they export. In general, their business is to import from outside of the European Union and then have their sales within the Euro area. Now, then I further divide these firms by size ranking of gross trade. So you can see here that the share of total exports that is accounted by the top 100 exporters is 50% of the total. So the level of concentration here of French trade is pretty standard, especially in developed markets and many other data sets, very concentrated. You can also see that the top 100 exporters and domestic oriented firms trade in many different countries, so 86 or 40 on average. They trade in many different 8-digit level industries, and they also use, on average, a large amount of currencies in their operations, 16 different currencies for the top 100 exporters. However, what I want to focus your attention on is on the fact that once you condition on the amount of currencies used per market, meaning per unique combination of country and industry code, most of these firms, regardless of size, only trade in one single currency. And I can tell you in advance that this is either the dollar or the euro. So they either pick their own domestic currency or they pick a vehicular currency, which is the dollar for their trading operations. And this currency tends to be stable over time. I very rarely see that these currency changes. And I'm happy to talk more about this maybe during the discussion, but I would say the main message that I get from investigating this database is that typically there is one invoice currency per market that these firms use, and that is a stable choice over time. Now, let's jump now to the transaction level estimates. Here I measure a standard exchange rate pass-through specification at the product and year level. A product J is defined as a unique combination of firm identifier, 8-digit level industry, country identifier, and invoicing currency. I do this because I want to identify the same share, but sold in different countries are two different shares, and I want to control for all these dimensions. The dependent variable is the yearly log differences of a product J's either unit values, quantities, or value traded, and this is specified in euros. And then here, a positive improvement on the exchange rate variable will mean that there is a depreciation of the euro vis-a-vis a currency P. And of course, what I want to do with this specification is showing you that whenever a good is priced in euros, or whenever a product is priced in dominant currency or in partner currency, we're going to have heterogeneous pass-through of an exchange rate shock into the values of trade of firms. Specifically, the focus of my paper is on this kind of regime, the dominant pricing regime, which is a situation in which the price is specified in dollars, but the trading partner is not the United States. So these are the, in a sense, main result from the transaction level side of the paper. In this graph, I show you the pass-through into these three kind of invoicing of a 1% euro depreciation into the value of this merchandise at the border. So you can see here that whenever firm prices their goods either in the partner currency or in the dominant currency, the value of these trade is highly sensitive to the exchange rate shock. There is a pass-through, for example, in the case of the dominant pricing that goes from 60 to 80% of the exchange rate shock. So what is happening here? It is useful to decompose the effect of a value, the effect into the value of euros between the two subcomponents, the response in price and the response in quantity, right? So here in this other graph, I show you in a more transparent color, the response of the volume of trade after a 1% euro depreciation. And in a darker color, more opaque, I show you the response of the price specified in euro terms. So you can see that in the case of partner currency or dominant currency pricing, the volume responses are almost muted in the short term after a 1% euro depreciation. And all of the response in the value of trade is due to a price response. So what is happening here? Think of it in terms of, for example, the exporter that is pricing a good in dollars. Here, after a euro depreciation of 1%, the price in dollar is remaining stable after this currency depreciation, or just only a few goods in my sample are actually changing their price. That means that when this price is converted back into euros, there is an almost 100% pass-through into the value of the goods of this exporter. And the very same thing happens on the import side. So you look at this graph and you take into consideration the two green bars, and you sort of understand the reason why I titled my paper, The Valuation Effects of Trade. In the short term, it is a good approximation to think of an effect of an exchange rate shock into the value of merchandise as everything being purely due to a revaluation of the very same quantity of things that you were selling and buying. And that means that there is a straightforward aggregation to be made if you want to calculate these effects at the firm level. If there are no questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
No, I actually
please.
What you're saying is extremely, interesting and surprising. Is essentially what you're saying, that elasticity of quantities seems to be zero to prices. For if you make your inference of the dollar price in firms of the non-dollar price, the price movements are there, but the quantity movements are not. So essentially, the value movement is the price movement, since quantity doesn't respond, right? And so if you do the back of the envelope calculation of the elasticity of quantities, it's a zero, right? What's interesting, you could also do the same calculation of euro and non-euro pricing firms, right? And there, the elasticity of quantities is present, but it's less than 1. It's something about 0.5 or something like that. So, and I mean, it's annual elasticity. So we expect at annual horizon already some response to quantities to differential price changes, right? And so this is kind of like pretty amazing. It pushes the the elasticity puzzle, which we think is just too low in the time series, to like be close to zero, definitely less than 1. One thing that I noticed working with this data, that the estimates of these elasticities are quite sensitive to the set of fixed effects that you put. And so the fixed effects that you put, I understand, are the time fixed effects. One thing I would suggest is trying to do time industry fixed effects if you have enough data, so that the estimation is not the time series variation is very big. So if you don't put the time industry fixed effects, the interacted ones, you pretty much get everything of the aggregate variation exchange rates. But the cool thing about putting time industry fixed effects is then you can really identify the differential response of firms. And what we found in similar data is that the elasticities are quite a bit bigger in the cross section and in the time series.
Unfortunately, I can't show you the case actually on the quantity. I have it on the value here. But what I show in the paper as a robustness check is that, so here, if you incrementally add, so let's just look at this the dominant pass-through into the value, if you incrementally add more and more fixed effects, and even if you see here, firm industry year fixed effect, this is in the case of imports, which you found the most puzzling, and I also find the most puzzling. You find that at least on the value side, but quantity side is like fairly similar. These estimates don't seem to change much. They seem to be very stable. I find it very interesting per se. It is in line with a lot of papers that are finding that the elasticity conditional on an exchange rate shock seem to be much smaller than elasticities conditional on, for example, tariffs. There's something to be explored here a bit more. It might be related to the salience of these shocks. It may be related to some selection effect into different currencies here. Remember that I'm not claiming that these elasticities, first of all, it's hard to interpret it as elasticities in the first place. These are volume responses. I'm not calculating market shares here. But second, it's hard. Also, all of this is conditional on maybe some characteristics of this product, right? I'm agnostic about that. I'm only saying that when you see a certain currency of invoicing choice, this is the average effect of a pass-through that you can observe. And there's definitely more to explore here, though I agree with you, like theoretically wise. It's very interesting. However, I do show in the paper that in the longer run, these volumes effect respond more than for example, the euro side. So after 2 years, everything seems to like go back to normal, but the 1 year horizon is still, there seems to be not enough time yet for these effects to respond, at least in this data set. So I ran several robustness check on these regressions. Of course, I'm happy to talk about them towards in the discussion side. I've already showed a little bit of the robustness checks that I ran, and given what we've seen at the product level, it's interesting now to check whether these exposures to exchange rate shock pass through into the firm operations. Before doing that, I want to show you how these exposures distribute among the firms in my sample. So here I aggregate at the firm level all the dollar pricing exposure, and I calculate the net exposure for each firm. So there was a question in the beginning about whether I ran the net effect between exports and imports or just the gross. So here, everything that I will start working on from now on will be this black line in these two panels, which is the net exposure in dollars, exports minus imports in dollars over total trade. And then in these two panels that I divide between exporters and domestic oriented firms, I also show you the long exposure to the dollars, meaning the exports in dollars, versus the short exposure to the dollars, meaning the imports in dollars. What you can see is that for exporters, medium-sized and small-sized exporters very rarely use the dollar. And more interestingly, even when they have a tiny amount of imports that are priced in dollars, they try to hedge that amount with exports that are priced in dollars, so that virtually their net exposure is pretty much always zero. Only the very top exporters have positive exposure to dollars, but they also partly hedge these long exposure to the dollars. The domestic oriented firms, remember by definition, these firms are importing from outside of the European Union, but they are having their sales within the European Union. These firms are typically in the wholesale sector or in the construction sector or in the manufacturing sector. And by construction, they cannot technically price their products in dollars. And so they all have short exposures to the dollar, more or less regardless of size. And it's important to have this picture in mind when you want to understand some of the heterogeneous effects that I will show you later on. Now, for each firm, what I will do is to define a dominant pricing valuation income treatment, which takes into account the initial exposure to the dominant pricing of a good, of a firm. And then I multiply that exposure by a shifter an exogenous shifter in this case, or what I want to call an exogenous shifter, which is the euro-dollar exchange rate shock. The interpretation is that this treatment will give you the amount of euros gained from a certain invoice exposure to the euro-dollar exchange rate shock. Now, this exposure at the beginning of the sample is just a proxy for the dollar exposure that a certain firm has towards dollar price goods in the year 2000. It is just a proxy because remember, I cannot observe the currency of invoicing before the year 2011. So what I do to proxy for the initial exposure of firms is to take the amount of trade in a certain product J of a firm in the year 2000, and then I apply the dollar share in that very same product that I observe after 2011, and I assume it is the same in the year 2000. There is an assumption here that I make, which is that the choices of currency of invoicing of these firms are very stable over time. And of course, I make my best to verify that this is, to show that this is true in the sample that I can observe, which is from 2011 and 2017. And I also make robustness checks in the paper showing you that this choice doesn't seem to lead to any bias, except maybe some just noise in the estimates. So at most a downward bias. The important thing to consider though at this level of aggregation is the fact that once I consider exposure that are at the firm level, I'm adding an additional level of endogeneity into my treatment here, which is the exposure to dollar pricing that each firm has. Now, in this case, the exposure to dollar pricing is very endogenous to firms' unobserved characteristics. But given that my invoice valuation income is a shift share index, Borusiak and others have found that there is no need for these invoice currency shares to be exogenous as long as you have enough shifters, meaning enough exchange rate shock in your sample that are quasi-randomly assigned across firms and that are mutually uncorrelated. And the intuition here is that the quasi-randomness of these many shocks will asymptotically dominate the endogeneity introduced by the shares, if there are enough of them. So the second hypothesis is fairly testable, and I can talk about it towards the end. But the first condition is the one that needs to be further discussed. It assumes that depreciations, euro-dollar depreciations, affect exposed and non-exposed firms to dollar pricing firms equally, except through the invoice valuation channel that I'm interested in. So I rely to justify this assumption on the literature on exchange rate disconnect. Exchange rate shocks are found to be white noise processes, especially for developed markets, and very hard to predict. And secondly, on the very important fact that I'm only studying exposures to a vehicular currency, meaning that the currency of invoicing of the firms in my sample are different from the partner currency or the French currency. This means that I can still have meaningful variation in my treatment variable, and I can control non-parametrically for the trade exposure of each one of these firms. And how can I do that? Well, I run my specification at the firm time level, and I add my treatment variable over here. This is the one that we care about. But more importantly, I'm controlling for something that a standard paper that uses, for example, trade-weighted exchange rate indexes as a treatment cannot do. I use a trade exposure for each firm at the beginning of the sample in each country in the world and for each export or import flow. And I multiply that exposure by time fixed effects. So here I am de facto comparing two firms that are identically in observed characteristics and that are also selling the same product in the same country in the very same amount. And the only difference between them is that one currency is pricing that good in dollars and the other currency is pricing a good in euros. I also control, of course, to control for the French side of the trade by industry year fixed effects. I find that the pass-through of this dominant valuation income into the operational cash flow of firms is 45 cents on average on the euro. 45 cents on the euro on operational cash flows, so cash flows that don't include, for example, financial income. 3 cents on the euro on tangible capex, and 13 cents on the euro on salaries. Now, these are average effects of my dominant invoice valuation. And these average effects actually hide some even more interesting heterogeneous effects across firms. Now, if I run the same specification and I divide between the pass-through into cash flows between exporters and domestic-oriented firms, and then I further divide between large, medium, or small-sized firms defined by asset size, then I find that for very large exporters, the pass-through of this dominant valuation income is around 80 cents on the euro. And for domestic-oriented firms, the pass-through goes between 40 to 50 cents on the euro. Medium and small-sized exporters instead have a non-significant exposure. But this last part is quite unsurprising, right? Remember from my exposure that these firms have, the medium and small-sized firms actually have no exposure at all. So my treatment is basically not moving for this kind of firms. But for firms that have a non-zero exposure, I do find significant effect and significant pass-through into the cash flow, operational cash flow of these firms. However, there is another subtle point to make about this pass-through estimation. These are all euro on euro pass-through. So if there is a fluctuation of 1 euro at the border for large exporters, I more or less see that euro coming back into their operational cash flows. But this doesn't mean that the cash flows of large exporters are highly sensitive to the exchange rate. Indeed, if I run the same regression and I normalize each variable by the standard deviation, then I see that actually one standard deviation shock of a dominant valuation income only explain 1% of a standard deviation of the cash flow of large exporters. What does this mean? It means that the variation of cash flow of these large exporters is so large compared to the size of my treatment that these are peanuts for these firms. They're so large, maybe because of what Oleg was saying before, maybe because they are also exporting a lot within Europe, that actually they don't seem to be very salient for these firms. There are instead 4 to 5% impact on the domestic-oriented firms that are small and medium-sized. Remember that this is one standard deviation shock of an exchange rate shock that is affecting 4 to 5% of a standard deviation every year of the cash flow of domestic-oriented firms.
Omar,
what is also yes,
if
sorry.
it's a good time, I had a question.
Please, yes.
So I think it's a very interesting approach to identification. I just wanted to clarify something about this variable T that you use. So the theoretical idea would be that T is kind of a sufficient statistic for firm characteristics. And that's why you kind of compare the differential effect of one currency versus the other for firms that have the similar trade similar trade with this trade partner, right? And so the idea is that kind of aggregates all relevant.
I'm not sure it takes into account firm characteristics. I would say like firm trade characteristics.
Right. Yeah. So one thing I was curious about, for example, you'd be interested how likely is the firm to adjust prices, right? When exchange rate shock comes, if you price in euro versus dollar versus destination currency, there is a question of like which firms are likely to adjust prices, and maybe currency choice affects how often you adjust prices. This is one. The other one is like when you adjust prices, how much you actually want to adjust them. And so I wonder if you have the arguments here why controlling for T, like, is it supposed to take care of those things or it's not supposed to take care of those things?
I don't believe you can take fully care of those things. Firm characteristics here may still vary, conditional on a certain trade exposure. And what I do in the paper is showing that the pass-through at the product level do not vary much according to the size of the, like conditional on a certain currency choice, then the pass-through does not vary much according to the firm characteristics. And so I expect more or less the same effect on average, but there could be some specific firms, maybe, you know, they're very large, but they don't take into a large size part of the sample. There may be some firm characteristics, sure, that for which these effects vary. In that case, I would say it depends. I mean, in that case, I should be able to capture, in any case, a different level of cash flow pass-through at this stage due to those firm characteristics. I mean, the identification is still valuable. It's just, it turns into unnecessary sort of like further decomposition of this pass-through according to the firm characteristics, right? And according to the channel that you think is at play. Here I use size as a proxy of, I think, that like better represents heterogeneities across firms. But yeah, definitely there may be all of these firm characteristics that can still affect both the impact at the border and the impact as a consequence into the cash flows.
Sorry, Omar, you have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, so what I observe is that there is a pass-through into tangible investment only for small domestic-oriented firms. And the story here, why there isn't a materialization of investment pass-through out of these cash flows, pass-through that I observe for large domestic-oriented firms and exporter, is both a story of salience that I was telling you about, like these firms are very large, and so these shocks are not very salient for them, and a liquidity story. And I verify it in the paper. Let me conclude with the aggregate macroeconomic shock. This is an exercise that is just a partial equilibrium macroeconomic effect, and that just measures the direct effects of these firm level estimates. So what I do is that I take the firm level estimate that I estimated before for a certain variable y, either investment, payroll, or cash flow. And then I multiply that pass through by each firm in my sample, dominant pricing exposure. And then I simulate a 10% euro depreciation, which is equivalent to 1 standard deviation shock in the euro dollar. Now, summing up, all of these 3 effects will give you the amount of euros generated for each firm by a 10% euro depreciation. I sum up all of these euros, and then I scale these effects by the total amount of that variable in the sample of extra-European traders in France. So what I find is that the average estimate for France implies that a 10% euro depreciation implies a 0.4% response in cash flow, 0.1% response in investment, and 0.2% response in payroll. Now, if I was scaling the effect, for example, of investment by GDP, this effect will be 0.01 percentage point of GDP, so a very tiny effect. But this tiny effect hides some interesting heterogeneities between exporters and domestic-oriented firms effect. The cash flows of exporters respond to 2.6% of after this 10% depreciation, and minus 2.1% for domestic-oriented firms. And investment and payroll instead, these effects are much smaller, exactly because large exporters and large domestic-oriented firms don't have enough like pass-through of these cash flow fluctuations into the real variables. So I have 1 minute left, I think, or maybe I'm actually out of time. So I just want to tell you that in the paper, I also measure counterfactual to understand whether It is my tiny marginal estimates into payroll and investment that determine the small macroeconomic effects versus the firm hedging effect that I observe in the sample. And observe that both of these channels are at play. And at play, there is also, in a sense, the fact that typically, at least for France, the effect on exporters and domestic-oriented firms tend to perfectly offset each other. But this is just a result of the way that French trade is. There are a few very large exporters whose effect are long the dollar, and their effect perfectly match the negative effects that is very distributed across the domestic-oriented firms. But this may not be representative of the situation of other countries, especially in emerging markets. So to conclude, in this paper, I find that foreign price trade is highly sensitive to currency fluctuations. Such fluctuations are mostly absorbed into firms' cash flows, more or less regardless of the size of the firm. However, only small domestic-oriented firms have investments and salaries that are sensitive to foreign pricing exposure. This causes the fact that there are limited real macroeconomic effects of invoice valuation income, at least for France. However, the open question is still to understand whether this invoice currency exposure may be larger for other countries, especially in emerging markets. And there is also if you want to make counterfactual examples, of course, the open questions of why firms pick a currency over another and what determines the distribution within a country of those choices. But this is sort of beside the material for future research. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Omar. Thanks a lot for the presentation. So we have a few questions. I think one of them is from Sebastian Panelli.
Yeah. Should I ask now? Okay.
Yes, please.
Thanks a lot. It was very interesting. Is there any way, like, can you think about like non-linearities, like distinguishing between small shocks and maybe large shocks? I don't know if there are any in your sample, like to the euro versus the dollar.
Yeah, it would be very interesting. I would say I use yearly depreciation, which vary. So I have like 16 shocks between 2000 and 2016. The euro dollar is a fairly stable process. So I wouldn't say that I can distinguish between large and small shocks, but it is a very interesting question. In front of very large shocks, we may even think that firms are react differently in terms even of their like price adjustments. And I would say that this paper is more representative of sort of business as usual, fairly small shock responses to exchange rate shock.
Okay.
Yeah.
Linda, do you have a question?
Thanks.
Hi, this is Linda Goldberg. Very interesting work.
Thank you.
You know, I wonder if you might want to think about different ways of introducing the exchange rate change. For example, you know, currently it's the given change in the exchange rate, the observed one, but it could be that you consider the path of the exchange rate relative to some long-term trend or PPP. In other words, to think about whether it's transitory or more likely to be persistent instead of the random walk. So wondering if you thought about that kind of exercise.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I didn't push towards this kind of heterogeneity. It will be interesting to check. I mean, I guess there's two kind of questions. I can like sort of, I mean, we should discuss more about this, but I guess you can, it's the econometrician that checks and understands that some shocks are transitory or not in the exchange rate. And then there's like the question of what these firms perceive to be true or like to be there. My understanding, I mean, limited understanding of whenever I talk to some firms that are exposed to these kind of shocks is that they're not in the business of predicting exchange rate shock, that they typically are fairly agnostic. They say, oh, I don't know what's going on there. This, at least in the small firms, especially, that are the ones that are driving my results. But I think it would still be interesting, yeah, to like maybe try to assess this heterogeneity. I have to say, all of my variation is coming from the euro-dollar exchange rate shocks at the year level. So there I have 15 shocks. I'm not sure about the power that I would get out of like differentiating shocks that are transitory or random walks, but I think it would be interesting, especially to capture long-term effects.
Okay, Oleg, I think you had a question that you left for the discussion, right?
No, actually, we'll talk with Amar later. I actually have all mine responded.
That's good.
Okay, so I had the following question. So what do you think, which particular financial frictions might be important? I mean, under which financial frictions this cash flow might matter more for emerging economies?
So what I think is going on will be a bit speculation. I would say that unfortunately, so let me talk about the paper first. This is like a slide that I scanned. I try in the paper to assess heterogeneous pass-through of these kind of shocks into investment by trying to like understand what channel is at play here. Is it that some firms are financially constrained and some are not? Is it just a size effect, meaning maybe it's salience of these shocks, or maybe again it's a financial constraint? Is it that the large firms in my sample, and in fact this is true, I'm like working on it in these days actually, is it that the large firms in my sample are actually all multinational corporations? And very often these multinational corporations have a headquarters that is actually not in France. And so their operational currency is technically not the euro, and so I'm getting noisy estimates. All of these channels seem to be at play. So I find that there are significant investment pass-through only on domestically owned firms that are private, that are small, and that are financially constrained. But all of these channels correlate so much to each other that I cannot distinguish them, at least in my sample. And I sort of try to understand at the margin, what is the channel that is truly at play here? So I don't have enough power to truly tell you, it's the financial constraint. But at least sort of this exercise is also like a sanity check on my results. It shows you something pretty plausible. It's like probably a mix of all these stories. The sample that I have here in this paper is not representative of the economy. There are like very large firms in the sample that are very liquid and multinational corporations. And they have many ways to avoid having to change their investment decisions because of some exchange rate shock that might be going on. But conditional on a firm being small and domestic oriented, there it's clear that there are effects. And unfortunately, I cannot go like in the details from, at least from my findings on what is the marginal channel at play. What I also would like to point out is that I can observe in my sample, so I cannot observe sort of the financial hedging that these firms have in detail. So I cannot observe the derivative structure of these firms, nor the denomination of their current liabilities, like the currency of denomination of their liabilities. But I can observe the financial gains that they get every year. So if we expect that these firms on the side are making financial bets to offset this kind of exposure, we should see a negative correlation between my invoice valuation income and the financial gain of these firms. And what I observe in my sample is that typically the largest exporters are the ones that actually have financial income that always goes in the opposite way of my invoice valuation income, and this actually offsets, right? And it's like another plausible story of why maybe the operational cash flow impact doesn't turn out to be an investment income for this kind of firms.
Sorry, and all these estimates, this is conditional on having the same export-import net pass-through, or this is just export side?
Yeah, so this is like this is like my my treatment effect. So yeah, this is conditional on a certain net exposure, net operational exposure, conditional of that net operational exposure, and on a certain exchange rate shock hitting you. The largest exporters have an offsetting effect of their financial income towards that exchange rate shock. This is also suggestive that there is at least some partial hedging that the largest exporters in my sample are operating.
Omar, so if you add up the cash flow effect and this effect, the final answer is like still bigger than zero. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, it's still bigger than zero. Yeah, so the effect on operational cash flow is like 80 cents, and then you add this and it's still 60. But still that cash flow does not become zero. And so it's interesting to understand, okay, is that why isn't that operational cash flow, including financial income, not translating into a capex effect? I think what's important to take into account here is that this specific group of firms are all subsidiaries of multinational corporations. So I may not actually capture fully the financial income insurance that these firms are operating. So like I should say that. But I made this exercise sort of like as to have an information of the potential bias that that my estimates have. The fact that actually there is financial income offsetting my results means that maybe I'm having a downward bias in a sense of my estimates. But yeah, this is still open.
Clarify here. So if we were in a world where Modigliani-Miller applies, it's only the first elasticity that matters, not the later, right? You can have all sorts of financial hedge and side contracts, but from the point of view of optimal investment, the only thing you care about is really the pass-through into your prices, quantities, and revenues. And what you do to offload the risk should not really affect investment. There is one real quantity of investment that's optimal. And so the right elasticity is the first one. So now the interesting question is, of course, we probably don't believe we live in a world where Modigliani-Miller applies. And then we just don't have a theory which will tell us exactly what's the right elasticity. So here, the question that Dima asks is like, what is exactly the financial friction that we think would be important for us to understand which is the right elasticity, before hedging or after hedging or some weighted average or something like that. And this is, I think this is one of the very sort of interesting questions, is like what is our benchmark actually?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I understand. I agree. I 100% agree. And I think this is a good suggestion. I can definitely do more to sort of nail what the right elasticity is in this case. Yes.
Okay, sounds great. So any other questions? Okay, I guess then we're done for today. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks again, Omar, for a very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.